For years, Beijing's strategic narrative has relied on a carefully constructed aura of inevitability. The sheer mass of the Chinese Navy and its relentless blockade simulations were engineered to project one uncompromising message: Taiwan is isolated, and the Indo-Pacific belongs to China. But military supremacy on paper often fractures when it collides with the hard reality of geography. Recently, a single Japanese destroyer charted a deliberate course directly through the Taiwan Strait. It lingered in those contested waters for 14 hours, unhindered, unchecked, and completely unbothered by the largest naval force on the planet. Beijing's surprisingly muted reaction exposed a glaring vulnerability in its grand strategy. Because the most immediate obstacle to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan isn't just American aircraft carriers crossing the Pacific. It's the geographic trap waiting right on their doorstep. To truly grasp why this 14-hour transit shook the strategic calculus in the region, you have to look at Beijing's typical playbook. For months, China had been escalating its gray zone operations, testing boundaries without crossing the threshold of open conflict. Just weeks prior, a fleet of over 20 Chinese vessels pushed deep into Japan's exclusive economic zone. While officially designated as fishing boats, the coordinated maneuver carried all the hallmarks of a maritime militia operation, a calculated probe designed to test Tokyo's resolve and normalize Chinese presence in Japanese-administered waters. Tokyo didn't blink. Japan immediately dispatched patrol vessels armed with water cannons and scrambled military attack helicopters, forcing the fleet to retreat. That aggressive, unhesitating defense set the stage for what happened next in the Taiwan Strait. When the JS Ikazuchi, a highly capable Japanese destroyer armed with anti-ship missiles and advanced tracking systems, cruised into the strait, Beijing suddenly found itself paralyzed. There were no interceptors deployed, no aggressive shadowing maneuvers by the People's Liberation Army Navy. Instead, Chinese officials issued a sterile diplomatic complaint, framing the transit as a threat to sovereignty while watching from a distance. The contrast was staggering. Beijing will relentlessly bully civilian vessels or smaller Coast Guard units, but when confronted by a top-tier warship from an increasingly assertive Japan, the bluster vanishes. This shift in momentum didn't happen overnight. To understand the changing balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our strategic briefings. What we are witnessing is the dismantling of a decades-old regional order. For decades, Japan's military posture was defined by a single, overriding principle: strict self-defense. Following the Second World War, the nation adopted Article 9 of its constitution, explicitly renouncing war and the threat or use of force to settle international disputes. The Japanese self-defense forces were structured heavily around protecting the homeland, largely abstaining from deploying warships into contested international waterways or projecting power abroad. This pacifist doctrine relied on the assumption of a relatively stable regional order, backed by the robust security umbrella of the United States. But pacifism becomes a deeply fragile strategy when your closest neighbor is undertaking the largest peacetime military buildup in modern history. As Beijing rapidly expanded its naval capacity and began forcefully pressing its territorial claims across the East and South China Seas, leaders in Tokyo recognized that the old framework was obsolete. The architectural shift began in earnest roughly a decade ago, when the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe pushed through sweeping, albeit controversial, security legislation. He introduced the concept of proactive pacifism, allowing for a much broader interpretation of the Constitution. This legal mechanism authorized the military to defend allies under specific conditions, fundamentally altering how Japan could legally operate during a regional crisis. Today, that quiet break with pacifism has accelerated into a full-scale doctrinal overhaul. The Japanese government is no longer bound by the institutional hesitation of the past. Tokyo is currently in the process of doubling its defense spending, pushing its military budget to unprecedented levels, and aggressively modernizing its maritime assets. The strategic focus has pivoted from merely guarding the home islands to establishing a forward-leaning deterrence network. This means developing counter-strike capabilities, acquiring long-range standoff missiles, and integrating more seamlessly with allied forces. Japanese naval commanders are now explicitly preparing for scenarios that require active confrontation rather than localized territorial policing. The 14-hour transit of the JS Ikazuchi must be viewed through this specific lens. It was not a rogue operation or a spontaneous public relations stunt. It was the physical, steel-in-the-water manifestation of Japan's new security doctrine. By navigating a fully armed destroyer directly through a geopolitical fault line that China claims as its own internal waterway, Japan demonstrated that its era of passive observation has concluded. Tokyo is telling Beijing that it will not respect a unilaterally imposed blockade, nor will it permit the Chinese military to dictate the maritime rules of the Indo-Pacific. This operational shift deeply complicates Chinese military planning. For years, the People's Liberation Army formulated its invasion strategies under a comforting assumption that Japan would remain a dormant, purely defensive actor, politically paralyzed by its own constitutional constraints. Beijing banked on Tokyo staying out of the fight as long as Japanese soil was not directly attacked. Now, Chinese strategists must calculate the risks of facing a highly advanced, heavily armed, and politically resolved Japanese military willing to operate in contested zones. The foundational assumptions that underpin China's dominance have been fundamentally shattered. Beijing's ultimate strategic objective extends far beyond the subjugation of Taiwan. It requires breaking out into the open waters of the Pacific. But to achieve that breakout, the Chinese military must first overcome a massive, immovable geographical wall. In geopolitical terms, this defensive perimeter is known as the First Island Chain, a sprawling crescent of land masses stretching from the Japanese mainland, dropping south through the Ryukyu archipelago, and terminating just off the Taiwanese coast. It is a natural barricade that entirely dictates the naval calculus of the region. For the People's Liberation Army Navy to effectively isolate Taiwan and push American naval forces out of the theater, their fleets cannot afford to remain bottled up in the relatively shallow, confined waters of the East China Sea. Nuclear attack submarines require the deep thermal layers of the Philippine Sea to evade detection, and aircraft carrier strike groups need vast maneuvering space to operate effectively. The primary gateway to reach that critical deep water is the Miyako Strait, a highly contested waterway tightly bracketed by Japanese-administered islands. At roughly 150 miles wide, the Miyako Strait functions as an international transit corridor during peacetime. But in a wartime scenario, it instantly transforms into a deadly maritime choke point. Flanked by the heavily fortified island of Okinawa to the north and the Miyako Islands to the south, the strait offers no tactical cover. Any Chinese naval armada attempting to push eastward would be forced to navigate a narrow operational corridor monitored by overlapping Japanese radar networks, maritime patrol aircraft, and mobile surface-to-ship missile batteries. This is the geographic trap that quietly terrifies Chinese military planners. If Beijing orders an amphibious assault on Taiwan, its generals cannot merely direct their firepower across the Taiwan Strait. They are structurally forced to simultaneously secure their northern maritime flanks. Attempting to lock down the Miyako Strait to protect their advancing fleets would require neutralizing Japanese defensive positions. Doing so means directly attacking sovereign Japanese territory, instantly plunging Tokyo into a full-scale kinetic conflict and erasing any hope of keeping the war localized. Furthermore, this geographical chokehold is permanently reinforced by a massive American military footprint. Okinawa alone serves as a cornerstone of U.S. force projection, hosting tens of thousands of active-duty military personnel alongside critical air and naval facilities. Any preemptive Chinese strike designed to blind Japanese coastal defense networks along the Ryukyu chain carries an incredibly high risk of spilling over into American bases. That tactical necessity virtually guarantees an immediate, overwhelming retaliation from a combined Allied coalition. Ultimately, geography forces the Chinese Navy into a catastrophic logistical dilemma. The immense volume of naval and aerial firepower required to simultaneously execute a complex amphibious invasion, suppress hardened Japanese missile batteries, and shield against incoming American carrier groups stretches Chinese forces incredibly thin. Japan's physical geography funnels an advancing adversary into a highly predictable, easily targeted kill zone, proving that sheer naval mass cannot easily overcome a deeply fortified map. China frequently highlights its status as possessing the world's largest navy by sheer hull count. But to counter a massive numerical flood, a defending force does not necessarily need to match ship for ship. It requires qualitative superiority, networked sensors, and highly mobile strike platforms. This exact strategic calculus is driving Tokyo's most aggressive naval procurement program in modern history, fundamentally altering the tactical equation in the East China Sea. For years, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force operated the JS Izumo and the JS Kaga strictly as helicopter destroyers. Publicly, these massive, flat-decked vessels were primarily tasked with anti-submarine warfare and disaster relief. They were carefully classified and politically framed to avoid any constitutional friction regarding offensive aircraft carriers. But as the security environment deteriorated, that artificial restriction quietly evaporated. Both ships have recently undergone extensive structural modifications, replacing their bow sections and retrofitting their flight decks with specialized heat-resistant coating. These structural upgrades were engineered for one specific purpose: to operate the F-35B Lightning II. By integrating the short takeoff and vertical landing variant of the world's most advanced stealth fighter, Japan has effectively resurrected its fixed-wing naval aviation capability for the first time since the Second World War. A single Izumo-class carrier is now capable of deploying between 12 and 15 of these fifth-generation aircraft, turning a defensive sub-hunter into a lethal, forward-deployed strike platform. The tactical implications of this transformation are profoundly disruptive for Chinese naval planners. The F-35B acts as much more than a traditional strike fighter. It operates as an invisible, high-altitude sensor node capable of silently penetrating deeply contested airspace. These aircraft can identify Chinese surface action groups or incoming bomber squadrons from hundreds of miles away, processing that battlefield data and instantly relaying targeting coordinates back to Allied missile batteries, land-based interceptors, or submarines lurking in the Philippine Sea. By converting these vessels into floating mobile air bases, Japan exponentially expands its operational radius and severely complicates Beijing's targeting cycle. Chinese naval forces attempting to navigate the Miyako Strait or enforce a localized blockade around Taiwan can no longer assume they will only face land-based aircraft launching from static, easily targeted runways in Okinawa. Instead, they must constantly account for highly mobile stealth strike groups operating unpredictably across the vast, open expanse of the Pacific. Suddenly, the massive numerical advantage of the People's Liberation Army Navy begins to look less like an overwhelming, unstoppable armada, and more like a densely packed, target-rich environment. When these floating air bases are integrated with Japan's fleet of nearly 50 modern destroyers, Tokyo achieves a fluid, highly adaptable defense network. It is precisely the kind of decentralized, technologically superior force structure that a rigid, top-down military apparatus like China's struggles to neutralize. Why would Tokyo willingly risk a devastating kinetic conflict with a nuclear-armed neighbor over an island that is not technically its own territory? The answer lies outside of shared democratic values or ideological alignment. It is rooted entirely in the brutal, unforgiving realities of resource dependency. Japan is a highly industrialized island nation completely devoid of the natural resources required to sustain its own population. To keep its vast manufacturing sector functioning and its national electrical grid powered, Tokyo relies on a constant, uninterrupted flow of global maritime traffic. The overwhelming majority of these critical supply lines, carrying millions of barrels of crude oil from the Middle East, liquefied natural gas, and vital industrial components from Southeast Asia, must transit directly through the maritime corridors surrounding Taiwan. The Taiwan Strait, the Bashi Channel, and the Philippine Sea collectively form the central circulatory system of the Japanese economy. If a hostile, heavily militarized power seizes control of this geographic nexus, they essentially hold their hand squarely over Tokyo's windpipe. This profound vulnerability explains a fundamental, highly calculated shift in Japanese political rhetoric. It is the reason why the Japanese government has formally begun categorizing a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan as a survival-threatening situation. In the meticulously crafted lexicon of Japanese defense policy, that specific phrase is far from a standard diplomatic protest. It is a precise, legally binding operational trigger. Under the revised security legislation passed a decade ago, declaring a survival-threatening situation is the exact legal threshold required to activate Japan's right to collective self-defense. It dictates that an unprovoked assault on Taipei and the subsequent disruption of those vital sea lanes can be interpreted as an immediate existential threat to the Japanese state. This legal mechanism authorizes the self-defense forces to deploy assets, provide lethal logistical support, and engage in active combat operations alongside American and allied militaries, even if Japanese sovereign territory has not yet been struck. Beijing fully grasps the immense leverage this scenario provides. A successful annexation of Taiwan would grant the People's Liberation Army the absolute power to dictate the terms of Japanese global trade. A Chinese-occupied Taiwan would instantly transform the surrounding waterways into a heavily fortified maritime exclusion zone, bristling with anti-ship batteries and radar arrays. Commercial shipping conglomerates bound for Yokohama or Tokyo would face astronomical insurance premiums, the constant threat of Chinese interception, and the reality of a de facto blockade. It would effectively reduce Japan to an economic hostage, permanently subservient to Beijing's strategic whims. This existential dread is the true catalyst behind Tokyo's increasingly aggressive naval posture. When the JS Ikazuchi deliberately navigated the Taiwan Strait, it was executing far more than a standard freedom of navigation patrol. It was a signaling mechanism, demonstrating that Tokyo views the waterway not as a peripheral security concern, but as an absolute prerequisite for its own national survival. Japan is drawing a rigid line in the ocean, warning Beijing that any attempt to sever the maritime arteries that keep the Japanese state alive will be met with the full force of a newly awakened military. Tokyo's strategic awakening is not confined to its own domestic rearmament. Recognizing that a localized military buildup is insufficient to deter a power as massive as China, Japanese strategists have begun aggressively exporting their security umbrella across the broader Indo-Pacific. The goal is no longer just to fortify the home islands. It is to construct a sprawling, decentralized network of containment designed to systematically disperse and exhaust Chinese military resources. The primary instrument driving this regional architecture is a newly established diplomatic mechanism known as Official Security Assistance, or OSA. For decades, Tokyo adhered to a strict, self-imposed ban on exporting military equipment or providing defense aid to foreign nations. The OSA fundamentally shatters that taboo. It allows the Japanese government to directly fund, equip, and supply the armed forces of like-minded nations that sit along the critical maritime corridors spanning the South China Sea. Initially, the financial commitments appeared relatively modest, starting as a trickle of specialized funding. But the trajectory is unmistakably steep, with the allocated budget rapidly expanding as Tokyo identifies new strategic partners. Crucially, this security assistance is highly targeted. Japan is not distributing aid at random. It is meticulously funneling coastal radar systems, maritime patrol vessels, and advanced surveillance drones to frontline states like the Philippines, nations that are currently enduring daily gray zone coercion and territorial intimidation from the Chinese maritime militia. By arming these coastal neighbors, Tokyo is executing a brilliant maneuver in asymmetrical deterrence. Chinese military planners preparing for a cross-strait invasion of Taiwan already face the daunting prospect of securing their northern flank against American and Japanese forces operating out of Okinawa. Now, because of the OSA framework, Beijing must also worry about a rapidly militarizing southern flank. If the armed forces of the Philippines possess the sensor networks and coastal defense missiles to effectively monitor and contest the Bashi Channel, the People's Liberation Army Navy finds itself boxed in from multiple directions. This multi-front dilemma completely unravels Beijing's preferred strategy for a Taiwan contingency. The Chinese military doctrine relies heavily on overwhelming mass and localized superiority. They intend to concentrate a massive, unified force to quickly overpower Taiwanese defenses before a coordinated Allied response can materialize. But Japan's network of containment forces China to split its focus, divide its naval assets, and constantly monitor overlapping threat vectors across thousands of miles of contested ocean. Ultimately, a Japanese destroyer cruising through the Taiwan Strait is simply the most visible manifestation of a much deeper structural shift. Through mechanisms like the OSA, Tokyo is systematically transforming isolated, outgunned Southeast Asian nations into capable nodes within a unified defensive perimeter. Beijing is no longer preparing to face an isolated island. It is staring down a heavily armed, highly integrated coalition deliberately engineered to exploit every geographic vulnerability the Chinese Navy possesses. Beijing, however, is not simply absorbing this strategic encirclement passively. Unable to directly punch through the first island chain without triggering a catastrophic regional war, Chinese leadership is actively seeking alternative methods to project power and restore its heavily cultivated aura of dominance. The most immediate and visible countermove has been a rapid deepening of its strategic alignment with Moscow. By tightening this authoritarian axis, Beijing hopes to present a unified, two-front challenge capable of stretching the U.S.-Japanese security architecture to its breaking point. We are already witnessing the physical manifestation of this partnership in the open waters of the Pacific. Chinese and Russian naval task forces are increasingly executing joint patrols, deliberately navigating through international straits near sovereign Japanese territory in highly choreographed shows of force. These combined maneuvers are a calculated response to Tokyo's aggressive rearmament and the expanding presence of Western allied navies in the Philippine Sea. Beijing is desperately attempting to signal that it can still project a formidable blue water threat, despite the geographic choke points threatening to box its fleets in. But there is a glaring operational vulnerability in this specific countermove. While the People's Liberation Army Navy boasts a massive, rapidly modernizing surface fleet, its Russian counterparts are largely operating a decaying force of aging, Cold War-era frigates. A joint naval patrol might provide excellent optics for state-run media broadcasts in Beijing, but tactically, it does absolutely nothing to solve China's fundamental geographic dilemma. Deploying creaking Russian vessels alongside Chinese destroyers does not neutralize the immense tactical advantage of Japanese stealth fighters launching from mobile, forward-deployed flat decks. The true, immediate danger of these escalating countermoves isn't necessarily a deliberate, pre-planned Chinese preemptive strike on the Ryukyu Islands. The far more terrifying scenario is a lethal miscalculation in an increasingly congested, hyper-militarized maritime corridor. As Chinese commanders increase the tempo and aggression of their operations around the Miyako Strait to test Allied resolve, their warships and combat aircraft are constantly brushing up against heavily armed Japanese and American patrols operating on hair-trigger alert. This friction is exceptionally volatile around the airspace and waters of Okinawa. With tens of thousands of active-duty American military personnel deeply entrenched on the island, the operational margin for error is effectively zero. A mid-air collision resulting from an aggressive Chinese intercept, or a misinterpreted radar lock between rival destroyers navigating a narrow transit lane, could easily spiral out of the control of diplomats. Because the geographic trap of the first island chain is so physically tight, any localized skirmish threatens to instantly ignite an uncontrollable, theater-wide conflict. Ultimately, Beijing finds itself forced into a highly reactive, deeply uncomfortable posture. The psychological intimidation tactics that proved so effective against smaller, isolated neighbors have entirely failed to crack the resolve of Tokyo. Instead, China's relentless gray zone coercion has only accelerated the exact containment network it feared most, leaving its grand naval ambitions permanently stalled at the edge of the Pacific. For years, the strategic balance in the Indo-Pacific seemed to be tilting inevitably toward Beijing. But naval supremacy is not merely a math equation of tonnage and hull counts. It is a brutal collision of geography, advanced technology, and political will. The deliberate navigation of a Japanese destroyer through the Taiwan Strait serves as a stark, undeniable reminder that the geopolitical map is deeply stacked against a Chinese maritime breakout. Japan has recognized the existential threat to its own survival and fully awakened from decades of strategic passivity. By rapidly fortifying the first island chain, deploying fifth-generation stealth fighters on mobile flat decks, and actively exporting security assistance to frontline Southeast Asian nations, Tokyo has transformed a vulnerable maritime corridor into a hardened, multi-layered trap. The Chinese military, heavily optimized for rapid localized dominance, now faces the agonizing reality of a congested, hyper-fortified choke point that threatens to paralyze its fleets before they can even reach the deep waters of the Pacific. The era of uncontested gray zone coercion is effectively over. A new, significantly more rigid deterrence line has been explicitly drawn across the East China Sea. Moving forward, leadership in Beijing must calculate whether an assault on Taiwan is actually worth triggering a theater-wide kinetic conflict that could permanently cripple its own global ambitions. How do you think Beijing will attempt to crack Japan's island chain, and can they realistically do it without triggering a wider war? Let us know your strategic assessment in the comments below. And if you want to stay ahead of the curve on the shifting balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more in-depth geopolitical analysis.